An all-out energy war between Russia and the West has deepened the energy crisis in Europe. In retaliation for being hit with sanctions, Moscow has been cutting off energy supplies to the region, leading to a massive crunch and soaring prices. Before the war, 40% of Europe's gas came from Russia. Now, following supply cuts and the shutting down of Nord Stream 1 pipeline, the figure is down to somewhere around 9%. How is it hurting Europe? How are countries in the EU reacting to the supply crunch? Also, how is the energy war impacting energy transition? Well, that's the global debate. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Teena to discuss the implications of the escalating energy war between Russia and the West. I'm joined by an illustrious panel of experts from different parts of the world. Pleased to welcome on this edition of the Global Debate, Dr. Paul Sullivan, non-resident senior fellow, Global Energy Center, Atlantic Council. Dr. Sullivan, thank you for your time. Welcome to Sansad TV. Also delighted to welcome Mr. Kaushik Deb, senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Mr. Deb, glad to have you on the Global Debate. Also, pleased to have on this edition of the program Mr. Nicholas Bergmans, a lead European Affairs energy climate expert, IDDRI. He joins us from Paris. Thank you, Mr. Bergmans. Glad to have you on this edition of the Global Debate. In fact, let me begin the program today with you. Give us and our viewers a sense of how bad is the energy crisis in Europe, and also the fact that shutting down of the Nord Stream pipeline, how has it exacerbated the crisis that began with the start of the Russia-Ukraine war back in February?
So the impact of the crisis has been progressively sinking in the European energy system for the whole year, basically. There's two principal impacts. First, we have less energy, less gas available for the EU, and worries for either we have enough gas to pass the next winter. But the second effect is the effect on price that has been massive. The price of gas has been multiplied by a factor of 10 in the European energy market. And it has had also an impact on the electricity price because we produce electricity also from gas, and this sets the price on wholesale market in Europe. So there, same-wise, we have a tenfold increase in the electricity price. So this has already an impact on EU industries. We've seen a wave of industry that are closing down for the winter in Europe, but it also led to policy reaction in terms of preparation for the next winter, coordinating who needs to shut their energy consumption, and also priorities for the longer term, increase the renewable targets, new measures to accelerate investments in LNG terminals to bring gas from elsewhere. So this is really something that is progressively implemented in Europe, but that is really at the core of the European debate right now.
Dr. Sullivan, ahead of winter, the crisis has escalated. Europe is reeling under massive energy crunch. We're seeing policymakers actually swinging into action, but what really are the options that EU has in terms of looking at alternatives for energy supplies?
Well, one of the biggest alternatives for energy supplies is to be more efficient and to have better demand management and better pricing. But aside from that, you can look at increasing sources from Norway. The US is exporting a lot more LNG. Algeria could be part of this. Azerbaijan could be part of this, but it's kind of in a dust-up with the Armenians these days, which I find very curious in its timing. Also, there's a lot of natural gas underground in the EU that the EU is not touching because they've outlawed fracking for the natural gas or exploring for the natural gas. There's Australia, there's Qatar. I saw a lot of Qatari QMAX tankers heading toward Europe through the Suez when I was in that region in the summer, a lot more than I would have seen a couple of years ago. There's a discussion of having a pipeline from Nigeria up through the Sahara to the coast of the Mediterranean, which has been discussed since I started studying energy back in the time of the dinosaurs. And the probability of that actually happening, I would put it close to zero. But at least they're talking about it because sometimes politicians say things in order to give the people the impression they're doing something. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, which is a treaty organization started in 1973, has set up multiple possible projects to cut down on gas use and to find alternatives. The EU Commission has been doing the same thing. It's not like they've been sitting back and sipping their tea and saying, oh, we can't do anything about this. They're looking into this. It's happened very, very quickly. You have to adjust this massive energy system of the European Union, which never really got to the single market, which makes it even more complicated to deal with this. And another important aspect for the audience to understand, and I'm sure the other guests understand this too, is that each and every country has a different natural gas need as a percentage of their overall energy needs. And many countries import a lot larger percentages of Russian gas than others. For example, Germany and Italy and the Eastern European countries have always been more dependent on Russian gas. And just as another, not necessarily an aside, but an important factor, the United States has been warning the European Union since the time of John F. Kennedy's presidency to not rely so much on Russian gas. Margaret Thatcher warned them. Many others warned them. EU leaders have been talking about this for some time. But when you have cheap and easy gas to get from Russia, you just keep on importing it and hope for the best. But look where they're at now.
Okay, Dr. Sullivan, so the kind of implications it is going to have on energy security, on energy transition is something that we'll discuss in the course of the program. I'll come back to you to discuss that. In the meanwhile, let me bring in Mr. Kaushik Deb into the discussion and get his viewpoint. Mr. Kaushik Deb, so, as European countries scramble for alternatives, looking to, fulfill their energy needs at the onset of winter, what is the kind of impact that you see on people, especially in, this 28-nation bloc?
Well, as kind of Paul was mentioning, this is not an easy winter for anyone, and especially so in the European Union and the continent there. The more important thing here is that a lot of the cargoes and molecules of natural gas that are going to Europe are actually coming from other parts of the world, which would have ordinarily consumed natural gas and move forward with their energy transition. So to the extent that these molecules of natural gas, the QMax and the Suezmax cargoes that Paul was talking about, are ones that would have ordinarily gone to India or China. These countries in Asia are having to use a lot more of coal to power their energy needs. Now, households within Europe would suffer quite considerably. Industry in Europe is already suffering quite considerably because there is less energy. But the way that Europe has had to react to this crisis is particularly unfortunate because Europe itself is now having to turn back to coal, a choice that wouldn't have been viable or interesting any time earlier this year or last year. So one would have to kind of think about why the European energy transition has taken so long, and why is it that Europe still depends on cheap hydrocarbon imports from elsewhere in the world.
Dr. Bergmans, as this crisis is escalating, policymakers are looking at various measures. Last week, we saw a series of meetings. The European Commission President has announced several measures. The question is, depending on the need and the dependence of these countries in the EU on Russia for energy needs, how feasible are these measures? Are they sustainable in the long run? And will all of these countries within the EU be able to, or will they give their consent to these measures that are being talked about?
Yes, that's a very important question. Just to give a bit of perspective, the important thing, like the good thing in all that, and part of the reason why progress has been done during the past months is that the EU had a plan. They had the energy transition plan, and they had a bunch of legislation coming through with its Green Deal to adjust its targets to reach climate commitments, so reduce emissions to minus 55% in 2030. And this meant that already we were planning to reduce our consumption from gas by 30%. The question is obviously whether we'll be able to walk the talk and deliver on these big ambitious plans. And I just want to highlight what has been said in terms of increased coal production. This is also happening in Europe, but this is so far limited to coal power plants that were supposed to close down and are now see their closure delayed. And in the end, a failure of the energy transition, a second failure would be to have this coal continue in time, and this will happen if we don't deliver on energy savings that as we plan and on developing renewables. That are the two solutions that are really open to Europe. I just want to react also on what Dr. Sullivan said in terms of the gas that is underground. The fracking has been a controversial issue in Europe, but is so far not much in the debate because of environmental reasons, the very reason why we have this common strategy of the Green Deal. And I would tend to think that it's kind of an option that will stay close at EU level. The UK has a different debate on that, but at least in European countries, I don't see that that would be an option. So really the two options that EU has now is renewables and delivering on energy efficiency and energy sufficiency.
Okay, so that was about how Europe is dealing with it. Dr. Sullivan, the UK has a new prime minister. She's assured some kind of energy security, energy measures for its people. How feasible and sustainable is it in the long run?
Well, she and Mr. Rees-Mogg recently said that they're going to take off the restrictions on fracking. That will not immediately bring natural gas flowing more into the pipelines. This is going to take time. It is faster to get the frack gas out than, let's say, onshore and offshore conventional gases, but this is not going to happen overnight. One thing that I am very concerned about with regard to UK policy are the massive subsidies they're going to be giving to their people. I see the political reasons for that, but how are they going to pay for these subsidies? And the EU is going to be doing something similar. Okay, let's subsidize everyone to keep people happy so they vote for us. And so the streets don't explode. But that one funny thing about debt, you have to pay it back. It's funny, sad, because the debt for the EU and UK is going through the roof, and it's going to be worse now. But the politicians look to the short run. How are they going to get elected? Energy people, like the three people you see here, like to look more at the longer run or at the medium run. The short run is not the answer to any of this stuff unless you want to keep things short run solved. This is something India is looking at too. The prices for the coal, particularly the coking coal for producing steel for India, are going through the roof, and they're 85% reliant on outsiders. This event, this energy shock in Europe is affecting India directly through its natural gas prices, through its imports of natural gas from Russia, through its imports of oil from Russia. Well, it's not importing so much LNG just yet, but there are deals being made between GAIL and the Gazprom. But the main, I think, worry for the steel companies in India, as I understand it, I wrote my PhD partly on India, so I kept my ears and eyes on that great country, is the cost of energy will affect India's development, but it may also push the government and industry to look more into their energy transition, which is going rather quickly with solar and wind.
Yes.
But one thing we haven't talked about yet is nuclear power. And it does take a long time to deploy these, to get these on the ground and working. But there are new technologies, advanced small modular reactors, which can be developed much more quickly and actually end up being safer in many ways and use less water. So nuclear is, according to my view, I don't know about the other two guests, is a lot cleaner and safer than many other energy sources. Certainly coal, oil, and gas. Last year, 18 million people died because of pollution from coal, oil, and gas, coal in particular. Not many people died from nuclear, even in the big accidents that everyone talks about. Nuclear is part of the future. Solar, wind, energy efficiency, better pricing, better demand management. There are lots of things we can do. We can't just sit back and get worried and watch the tensions go up. Energy advisors and experts like these other two folks and I have been talking about these things for a very long time. There are solutions, but the political solutions aren't necessarily the best ones. You have to think about, well, energy investments are lumpy. They're big.
Okay,
mostly,
so
and they take time.
that's an interesting aspect. What does Dr. Dev think on this? Let me bring in his viewpoint on nuclear being the future. Dr. Dev, do you agree? And is that why we see countries like Japan that have suffered nuclear disasters, the worst of its kind, now going back to nuclear?
In many ways, I think kind of nuclear is very much a part of the solution that we are looking for the future, but also the immediate term. As much as Europe has had to go back to turning back on mothballed coal power plants, if nuclear in France was operating at capacity, wasn't kind of suffering because of unscheduled and over delayed maintenance, this would have been a great opportunity for Europe to manage its energy transition to a zero carbon world using nuclear. In India, for instance, nuclear has to form a part of the 500 gigawatts of non-fossil capacity that the Prime Minister committed to at the UNFCCC Conference of Parties in Glasgow last year.
Yes.
But there's an interesting nuance around this, right? What type of nuclear works? Small modular reactors are something that are increasingly becoming a topic and a technology of interest. But to the extent that nuclear, for instance, in France, has had to rely on river water for cooling, and in turn, the river waters have been affected by climate change and drought, which has led to nuclear not being a viable option, you kind of see how vicious this circle of climate change can become. So one needs to kind of be able to think about this carefully, clearly, and make sure that the choices that we make are the ones that lead to a zero carbon or a decarbonized world in the near term or in the medium term, but also in a manner that does not tie us in choices that are affected by the very effects of climate change that we're trying to and seeking to combat.
Okay, Mr. Bergmans, let me come to you. So, since we're talking about nuclear being a part of the solution for, energy transition and clean energy for the world to ensure energy security, one of the biggest challenges with nuclear is what we are witnessing at the Zaporizhzhia plant. So the world clearly has no agreement to deal with what happens if a civil nuclear facility falls into a war zone. And that is what we are still scrambling with. So unless we have a clear-cut treaty to address that, do you think we should be moving towards nuclear?
Just to mention, in France, we have a lot of nuclear and we have a big nuclear history. I just want to mention before getting into this question that part of the crisis in electricity market in Europe is also linked to the fact that nuclear power plants in France has not been running as they used to. We are in a deficit of more than 100 terawatt-hours of nuclear production this year due to problems, and this represents 1/4 of what we produce normally. So it's not something trivial, it's something really important for the French energy system and the European one. We've seen a comeback to advocating for nuclear or defense of nuclear in the context of climate change. We know that nuclear is decarbonized, but there's always a question also on security that has led to the opposition of nuclear of certain countries in Europe. We have very different picture now, and now in the case of France, we have two different debates. What will happen with the current nuclear power plants? Should we shut it down later? Should we prolong it until we have enough other new capacities that come from renewables or something else? And also a debate on whether we should reinvest in new capacities of nuclear.
Dr. Sullivan, I'll come back to you. And now is the important aspect of energy transition. How do you see this crisis impacting energy transition? Has energy transition surged or has it stalled because of the energy crisis as an aftermath of the Russia-Ukraine war?
I'll give you an answer which may not be what you're looking for. Both are happening, depending on what country, what region of what country you're looking at. The United States, we just recently passed something called the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a massive set of subsidies and tax breaks and investment breaks to speed up the energy transition as such. For many others, however, including some of my own country, energy security, it takes the forefront in their thinking, not climate security or environmental security. What we're seeing in many places in Europe is energy security is taking over the discussion from energy transitions and climate security. We're dealing with two different clocks here, and the alarms are going to go off. For energy security, it's probably going to be a lot sooner than the climate security, but we're not sure. Recent reports have pointed out that tipping points are being approached a lot faster than otherwise thought. This is a scary moment, folks. And I'm going to say something that may be controversial, and if there are Russians listening, they may not be happy with what I'm saying, but this is me. I think one of the many reasons why Putin did this was to slow down the energy transition, because the energy transition would be against his interests. A huge proportion of his exports, his government revenues, are from oil, gas, and coal. But getting back to the nuclear issue, even if this issue is dealt with Ukraine, and that nuclear power plant, which I've always found difficulty pronouncing, is safe throughout it. It's important that we have some sort of an agreement about the protection of these plants. But something we have to think about is that over 50% of uranium enrichment capacity in the world is to be found in Russia. And pretty much the same amount of uranium conversion capacity can be found in Russia. If the European Union and others are looking for independence in energy, they have to look beyond just gas and oil to coal and to uranium and uranium services. There's a lot more to energy security than just natural gas. That's one part of a much bigger picture. But with regard to the energy transition, if we head toward solar and wind and greater energy efficiency, which I see as the most important part of the energy transition, then we can separate ourselves to a greater extent from the reliance on unreliable and dangerous partners. But then where is the gas and oil from Russia going to now? And this gets into some political complexities. India has increased its imports of Russian oil amazingly, slowed it down recently. There's a reason for that. They got good deals. India has its own objectives, its own reasons, its need for energy security and economic security.
Yes.
And also the price sensitivity for oil and gas and coal is very high in India. And these prices have been going through the roof. Most of these prices are global prices, and India can do nothing about them. India is about, 85% reliant on outside sources of oil, maybe 40% on outside sources of natural gas, and that's increasing. But for the type of coal that's needed for steel and industrial plants, they are 85 to 90% reliant. So this has a direct effect on the Indian economy and Indian stability.
Yes.
So this is not just a European issue or a UK issue or an American issue. This is an issue for the world. Japan is getting ruined by these energy prices.
Absolutely.
Their yen is dropping. One of the major reasons for the yen dropping is what's happening in energy markets and industry in Japan. It's all interconnected. And this may be a bit complex, but I think when people think about it, they'll get it.
Okay, Dr. Kaushik Dev, very quickly, I'll come back to you to understand and get your viewpoints on two specific points made by Dr. Sullivan. First, that, Russia is finding newer markets. So even if Europe cuts down on its supplies from Russia, it's not having an impact on Russia because it is selling its energy, it is sending its energy to other countries. The point is, if the G7 goes ahead with, price capping on Russian imports, is it going to backfire and worsen the crisis? Is it going to lead to an energy catastrophe of sorts in the EU? And the second aspect that he mentioned is that soaring prices are leading to energy poverty. How big a challenge is that for the world? What is the way ahead?
So I think the most interesting aspect of this particular development and this particular move right now is the time aspect. To the extent that there are going to be sanctions on Russia, to the extent that Russian molecules and barrels are going to be exiled from the Western world, they will find a place somewhere else. And I think in very many ways, it's in the interest of the West to make sure that these molecules and these barrels, this oil and gas, does find its way to India or China or Indonesia or Asia. Because if they did not, the way the energy prices would escalate, forget about being affordable in India or Africa, no one in the world, including the US and Europe, would be able to afford it. I mean, remember, President Biden's ratings were abysmal when gasoline prices were upwards of $5 in the US. That's exactly the kind of conversation that Liz Truss is having in the UK right now,
yes,
in terms of dealing with high energy prices and subsidizing household electricity bills. So there's a short-term aspect to all of that. But over the longer term, as long as these sanctions remain in place, they would erode Russia's capability and capacity to produce oil and gas. And to that extent, the world will have to adapt to a version where there is less supply. And hence, there is no other way around for everyone in the world, in Europe and in Asia and in the US, to deal and have more active participation in energy efficiency. I always like to say the cheapest form of renewable energy is energy efficiency, and never kind of discount the value of improving energy efficiency. The second thing I'd kind of also flag here is that a lot of the oil and gas that's actually flowing into Asia right now is oil and gas molecules that Europe would have refused to take on a variety of issues, whether it's on sanctions against Russia or the fact that the Russians themselves would want to weaponize their energy exports and make sure that they can bring Europe to heel and agree to their own terms. And this winter, as we started this conversation a little while back, is going to be supremely important to see whether Europe survives, whether Europe concedes, or whether the Russian economy tanks to a point where there is a situation where they have to agree to a resumption of somewhat of a normal
Certainly.
world.
Europe has had a difficult summer. We've seen the worst kind of drought in large parts of Europe in summer. Now, as they brace for winter, the larger question is, will countries within the European Union be able to prevail in the cold winter? So what happens is something that we'll all have to wait and watch. But time allows me to take up only that much on the discussion today. Thank you, gentlemen, once again for joining me on this edition of the Global Debate and sharing your thoughts, your views with us and our viewers. Absolute pleasure to have all three of you on the program today on Sansad TV. Thanks very much once again. So that's it from us on this edition of the Global Debate, viewers. Thank you very much for your time as well. I'll see you same time next week. Until then, you take good care of yourselves and keep watching Sansad TV.